Frank.
Hey, Mary.
This is part of the Multi-Include project and this conversation. And well, thank you for joining us. And I would like to ask you to first of all share with us a little bit more about your work on inclusive excellence and inclusive education.
Sure. So since about 2006, I have been using the Inclusive Excellence Framework to drive my research, scholarship, and praxis, which all really is about how do we create inclusive learning environments for all students, but in particular, historically marginalized students who haven't always had full access to higher education in particular. And so my work tends to focus on the classroom environment as one sort of site of possibility, and then the institution as a whole. And I am really engaged in work that seeks to transform how we think about education and creating opportunities for both students and faculty to be the best that they could be in the classroom.
So when we talk about inclusion is always linked to diversity.
Mm-hmm.
But can you share some more about what is diversity and what is inclusion, and what is the relationship between those two terms?
So in my work, I start from the premise that higher ed institutions were created for a certain population. And over time, that population has changed. But how those institutions approach the delivery of education hasn't. And so what that has created is a system where students who are often in the majority in positions of privilege have an advantage that students, whether they're new arrivals or recent migrants or students of color, have not had a chance to gain full access to the institution or the learning environment. And so my work is really how can we adapt higher education in ways that account for the increasing diversity of students in a way that suggests that a student's background, prior lived experiences, ways of being will not be a barrier to their learning.
So having a diverse classroom is not good enough?
No, we tend to think about that as the access part of the work. So let's open up the doors and allow different students to enter into the space. But entering into the space doesn't mean access. It means, and it doesn't mean inclusion until students have feel like they belong. So a sense of belonging, where students feel like they're validated, where students feel like they matter. So how do we create learning environments where all students feel a sense of that the space is designed for them to succeed?
Thank you. You spoke about privilege.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate a little bit on what privilege means in the U.S. context?
So in the U.S. context, higher ed institutions were created for primarily white populations. You have some institutions early on that were created that included indigenous communities in that, but in those cases, that was more of an attempt to assimilate and to socialize communities into the more dominant ways of being. So I think about the institution I work in and the ones I've been privileged to work in as traditionally white institutions, that numerically they are predominantly white, but it's more than just the composition. It's the ethos, it's the feel, It's the architecture, it's the content, it's the traditions, it's the rituals, all that suggest that some students belong and others don't. And so being in an environment where you believe that that environment is designed for you to succeed is a very empowering feeling.
So there are teacher training courses, and there are many education faculties who train future teachers and faculty. And so is it good enough that you master the theory, or is it also important what happens in the classroom and that you as a faculty, as a teacher, are able to make the connection with the diversity of students?
So it's absolutely important that if you think about diversity as a benefit, that you are in a position to extract those benefits. That simply putting people in a room and saying to them, figure it out, is not going to produce the positive learning outcomes that we want. And so we have to be facilitators of inclusion in order to extract those benefits. And so you can have an understanding and a mastery of the theory, but if you're not in a position to activate it, then it's not going to be very useful. And so what does activating mean? It means really thinking intentionally about how you move from theory to praxis and from praxis back to theory, so that there's a constant engaging, reflecting, doing, and then engaging, reflecting, and doing all over again.
And two things. First of all, you talk about intentional, being intentional, and also the quality of engagement with students. Can you give an example of an intentional strategy or activity, and also an example of how you work with students?
So, in my experience, most instructors teach the way they were taught. And so what we have is a recycling of traditional pedagogical practices that assume that all students are the same, and the way in which my instructors taught will work for me as I try to teach future students. And intentionality is the disruption of that repetitious cycle. Intentionality is really thinking about the pedagogical decisions you make and why you make them, and how your choices are connected to some understanding of what learning is and what learning can be, and also some kind of understanding of what it means to be included in the learning environment. So whether that's conceptually, theoretically, experientially, any of those can work. It's just suggesting that there is a method to the madness, that you have an approach that is grounded in some conceptual way of understanding what it means to facilitate inclusion in learning. Easy, I shouldn't say easy example because it was really challenging in the moment. I begin most of my classes with a narrative that introduces the students to the content of the course, and at the same time introduces the student to who I am and why I'm teaching this course and why this course is important to me. I showed up in class and suddenly realized that I had a hearing impaired student in my class. And my narrative was all about using voice, and how using your voice would be a central component of this learning experience. And I realized that the student didn't have a voice in a traditional sense. And so if I had stuck to my plan for that day, I would have excluded one student. Right? And so in that moment, I had to rethink how I was going to introduce the course and the narrative and make changes around not using voice, but using communication. Right?
Well, I think that that's really important, that communication is a way to connect with students, but that communication itself is a lot more than just a conversation. There are some faculty that are hesitant to be intentional.
Yeah.
And what I often hear is that teachers or faculty say, but I don't want to be stigmatizing. And so can you elaborate a little bit on that? Because the part of stigmatization is often in the message and not so much in the way you engage.
Yeah. So, and I'll put this in the U.S. context, the notion that as an instructor you don't see color is a safe way to think that you're engaging in equity. And what I say to teachers who hold that belief is that if you don't see color, then you don't see me, because my color always has and always will matter to me. Right? And but as someone who hasn't engaged in that way, that can be very frightening.
Yes.
And so I often tell folks, you can't just read a book. I mean, I'd love for you to read my book, but you can't just read my book and go out and say, tomorrow I'm going to try to do this.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work that has to go into it before you can do it effectively. And that work really begins with understanding yourself, who you are, what makes you who you are, the prior lived experiences that shape the way you think about education, that you think about learning, the ways in that different aspects of your identity inform your approach to teaching, like really unpacking and interrogating that. And in my experience, when you become comfortable doing that, you then become more self-actualized, and students can see the work and are more likely to trust that you have good intentions.
Yeah.
But it's a process, the hard work needs to happen.
Well, becoming aware of your own lens is definitely
Absolutely
a process. And in that process, using a certain language is also important. And you often talk about the importance of not using a deficit language. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes. In graduate school, I was on my way to, I won't say be a statistician, but I was on my way to using quantitative methods to drive my research. I was always fascinated by numbers and the potential that numbers had to help us understand some of the great educational problems of the day. And my instructor in my intermediate statistics class would always use these large data sets to help us practice running a regression model, for example. And I started to notice that all of the data sets involve things like unemployment, incarceration, poverty, health disparities, educational disparities, crime. And then it dawned on me that the communities that I belong to, particularly the Black community, always showed up in a certain location in these data sets. And I started wondering about why that was the case. And so that became a sort of paralyzing experience for me that made it harder for me to focus on the tools and techniques that my instructor was trying to get me to understand. And I often think about how my love for numbers might have been different if there were some positive examples, some positive data sets used instead of the negative ones. And so the examples that we tell, the stories that we tell are all indicators of what we value. And if we're always positioning certain communities in negative ways, that sends a message to members of that community that they don't belong, that they don't matter, right? So we have to be really intentional about how we frame problems, for example. There are a lot of social issues that impact how students are showing up to the classroom or to our institutions. But we tend to blame the students for having those experiences and not spend a whole lot of time thinking about what factors contributed to those students, to those experiences and conditions. And if we, the result is we end up thinking about students in ways that suggest they have to be fixed instead of saying that the environment needs to be fixed. So avoiding deficit language is important because through that communication, whether we intend to do that or not, we end up sending messages about what we value.
Is this also something that you discuss with students? And also, you work for the education department at the University of Denver.
Mm-hmm.
And is this also part of the curriculum?
It is a part of my curriculum.
Yes.
Yes. I'm teaching a course right now on navigating race identity in the politics of research. And the course is really designed to help future scholars think about science as a tool for liberation, and that they have an opportunity to engage in scholarship that can make a difference. And so, we talk about deficit frameworks and deficit language and deficit instruments, and
And this also, I think the fear some faculty have to talk about these issues is, can I say that it's often their own fear instead of the fears of students? Because I often have the feeling that students are prepared to talk about this because these are the things that they are encountering, like you said, in their lives on a daily basis.
I think some students are prepared. I teach in graduate programs, so I get students who have been through, elementary, secondary. They've pursued their bachelor's degree. Some have pursued their master's degree. And so they've been socialized to engage in education in a certain way. And when they come to my classroom for the first time and experience something different, that can create dissonance. That some students have become comfortable being invisible in a learning environment. And so we have to be careful about how we attempt to make students visible, because that can also be oppressive if we're not thoughtful about how we do that. So that's part of it. On the other side, yes, there is a great deal of fear of the unknown. Um, I haven't been trained to do it this way. And I haven't seen models of it, right? And so asking someone who was socialized in a certain way to explore new approaches that require vulnerability, flexibility, that require sharing power.
And how important is it in a world where the context of society is changing rapidly, where there is less tolerance for the different others in societies? And so how important is that to look for innovation in pedagogies, innovation in learning strategies?
Yeah. At a real basic level, at least in our context currently, the external environment has significantly shaped what is happening in the classroom. And so a faculty member's ability to navigate students who have opposing perspectives on the content, on the experiences, on what's happening in society has become increasingly more important. And we have a context where, because of what I would call bad modeling, folks feel like they can say whatever they want to say, that they can resist values of the institution related to equity and diversity. Those are creating challenging situations for instructors as well. And also in this context, if you make a mistake, the consequences can be costly for instructors.
Yes.
So all of those factors are working together to even create more pressure. But and it's probably easy for me to say, but I believe so much in the potential of what we can do as educators that it's worth embracing that fear to do that.
And do you think that educators from Europe, educators from Latin America, from North America, from Asia, in fact globally, can that be a global conversation?
It should be a global conversation, absolutely. There are every day fewer and fewer countries and parts of the world that have the privilege of saying, my community is just this, right? That diversity is happening everywhere, and we can face it, or we can continue to act as if it doesn't exist. And I think those choices have different consequences. And the institutions that face it and tackle it head on are going to, in the long run, produce better outcomes and create better communities. And the ones that don't will continue to see conflict and struggle and strife.
Coming back on the deficit language, your work is very much tailored around the concept of inclusive excellence.
Yes.
Which entails that inclusion and excellence can go hand in hand. Can you say a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I mean, you basically summarized it. Historically, we've been trained to believe that in order to be excellent, we had to be exclusive, that only the cream should rise to the top, and we should be in the business of weeding everyone else out. Inclusive excellence suggests that you can't be excellent without being inclusive, and you can't be inclusive without being excellent. Often people think if you're being inclusive, you're watering down the learning environment. Um, my students will tell you that my classes are the most challenging classes they've been in. The classes that have pushed them to learn at levels they didn't believe they could learn at. And at the same time, feel included in that process.
So you have high expectations of your students.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
So we are, with Multinclude, we have been collecting quite a big number of cases from all of Europe, outside of Europe, focusing on different education sectors. And in the analysis, we will embrace the work, your scholarly work. And can you say a little bit, can you advise us what some of the elements are that we have to take into account in our analysis if we look at the different practices and different learning strategies in relation to your work?
Mm-hmm. So, first of all, this is a really exciting project, and I can't wait to see the results of this important labor. What excites me about it is we get to see from a multitude of cases different approaches to facilitating inclusion. And all of those cases, both individually and collectively, represent a theory of change. And so the knowledge produced from this process is going to make a significant contribution to our understanding of what are some of the essential components of facilitating inclusion. Right? So that's one thing that we need more conceptual approaches to doing this work, and this project will produce that. Two, I think this project will also provide folks with concrete examples of what can be done in various sectors that together provide a robust kind of set of approaches that we tend to think about these as single issues. And what I'm curious about is how are these various change projects driving change at a sort of macro level, as opposed to, in this one class or in this one community, right? How are others being engaged in the change process? What strategies were used to make that happen? So folks will get some really important information about different strategies that can be used. And then the last thing, and I think this is probably more of a long-term goal, I'm interested in what are the costs to engaging in these change efforts? Not financial costs, but sort of social, psychological, political costs. How are people who are on the front lines of these various projects being supported? What kind of infrastructure is needed to empower and enable these freedom fighters to do the work that they're doing?
So is there a good inclusion and a bad inclusion?
Yes, there is definitely good ways to create inclusive environments and bad ways. In my own work, I rely on Martin Luther King Jr.'s concept of socially just practices to think about this distinction between good and bad practices. Socially just pedagogical practices are practices that are intentionally seeking to lift up the humanity of my students. in theory, those would be good practices. And the bad practices are practices that result in further marginalization in the learning environment, that result in causing harm or hurt, that result in exclusion of students. And it's taken me some time to know where that line is. There's some things I used to do early on that I no longer do because even though I thought there was a benefit to the experience, the potential for trauma still exists, and I couldn't justify it using that model. So to give you an example of that, my classes, because we focus on issues of privilege and oppression, power and discrimination, it's easy for folks to really go into a spiral of despair. And so I had to figure out, how do I keep my students remaining hopeful, even during their engagement in these really complex and difficult issues. And so one approach I took to do that was to always connect the interrogation of a problem with the potential for engaging in emancipatory imagination, right? Like, how can we, using our creative powers, think about alternative solutions to this problem? So that was one example of a shift. Asking students to engage in activities without giving them the preparation to do so. A common activity, and regardless of the discipline you teach in, is to form learning teams or to put students in groups to engage in collaborative work. And often what we do is we just put them in groups and we tell them to figure it out. Well, if you're thinking about the diversity in your class and in these groups, there's the potential for conflict. So how do you give in advance the tools for students to have a chance to succeed? Some people would say that figuring it out is part of the learning process. But if that figuring it out has the potential to cause harm, I can't justify doing it anymore.
Yeah.
So having that basic principle, thinking about my pedagogical practices in socially just ways, that's my barometer for deciding, should I do this or not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which asks a lot of you as a faculty. And so is, who are your support structures to make sure that you are constantly aware of what you do and give you energy?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things that I do more recently as I've become more mature in my teaching. I don't teach alone anymore. Yeah. So I always have, and I know this is a luxury because not everyone has this. I always have at least 2 teaching assistants who are intimately involved in the construction of the learning environment. They usually are former students who took the class previously. And I'm always asking them, so when I did this last year or the year before, did it work? How did you feel? And they're honest and say, actually, that didn't work. And so then we engage in the process of thinking about how we might do it differently. So that's one. Avoid teaching in isolation. I have a group of colleagues who, some are former students who are now professors. Some are folks who I went to graduate school with. And we constantly check in on how our classes are going, the different types of strategies we're using, what worked, what didn't work. So having that as a resource is helpful. And then I have my close friends that when I come home after class and I had a really intense moment in a classroom, I can talk through that experience with them. Um, those are just some of the things that I do. Yeah.
And the first part you mentioned, never teach alone,
Yeah.
is that something that could be a methodology or a practice for other faculty and teachers?
Yeah, absolutely. I wish higher ed institutions were more nimble and flexible that allowed for co-teachers.
Mm-hmm.
Some institutions are starting to do that. That allow for classes to combine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You work at the University of Denver, where you do scholarly work and also you have an administrative role.
Mm-hmm.
What are the parts that you've been most proud of in the past few years? I mean, you achieved a lot.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a hard question. I think for me, what has been most rewarding is I can see the tangible fruits of my labor in the students that I've had the privilege to teach, in the faculty members that have had the courage to engage in the hard work with me around how they can be more inclusive in their teaching, from the administrators who I can see a real shift in their thinking about these issues, that from our collective engagement, the choir has expanded, and that there are more people engaged in this work. Yeah.
So the learning part is
Yeah.
in fact the most valuable part.
Yeah.
And that you're aware of learning and also are aware of the challenges.
Yeah. I would say it's the learning and doing.
The learning and doing.
Right.
Yeah.
The learning is part one, putting it into action is part two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My final question, Frank.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you do this work?
Yeah. I would probably say that why I initially did this work was because I had particular experiences as a student, and I needed to figure out if there could be different ways to do it that would create spaces for future students so that they wouldn't have to go through some of the things that I went through. That's why I initially did it, or got involved in this work. I think more recently, what's kept me coming back to work every day is the belief that in higher education, as it's more than just this great equalizer. It is this notion that education can be a powerful facilitator of liberation and freedom. And whether it's creating learning environments that free students from thinking in narrow ways, to creating majors and minors that are committed to um, creating spaces where students can be the best that they can be, or institutions seriously taking on the challenge of creating socially just campus environments. I have seen possibilities of new ways of doing it, and so those possibilities create serious sense of hope in what can be done. And I will admit there are some days where I feel like we're asking institutions to do things that they're just not capable of doing. And then I'll get an email, or I'll get a note or a thank you card from someone who may not have directly engaged me, but was taught by one of my former students, or realized that their dean had sat in the workshop, that an administrator had an encounter with a student that allowed them to feel affirmed and seen and validated. And those moments serve as powerful reminders of what can be. So that's why I do what I do, and that's why I'm always trying to recruit more people to do it.
Well, thank you. We are certainly delighted to collaborate with you, and good luck.
Thank you. Thank you.